Have you ever been surrounded by people, talking, laughing, filling the space with noise, yet somehow, deep inside, felt completely alone? Harold had, and for the longest time he ignored it. He told himself it was normal, that this was what life was supposed to be. Social gatherings, endless conversations, staying connected, staying relevant. He showed up. He smiled. He kept the conversations flowing, even when they felt empty. And he convinced himself that as long as he was surrounded by people, he wasn't lonely. But loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from pretending. One evening, after another dinner filled with small talk and stories he had heard too many times before, Harold came home, kicked off his shoes, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The silence of the room felt heavier than usual. He poured himself a drink, walked over to the window, and stared outside. The sky was changing, soft gold melting into deep crimson, fading into the kind of quiet beauty that no camera could ever quite capture. The world outside didn't need an audience, didn't need validation. It just was. And then, a thought rose in his mind, gentle yet undeniable. This moment is beautiful, and I don't need anyone else to confirm it for me. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to reach for his phone, to take a picture, to tell someone about it just so they could agree that it was worth noticing. It was his moment, and that was enough. And in that stillness, a realization settled in. A truth that had been whispering to him for years, one he had always been too busy to hear. Do not look for sanctuary in anyone except yourself. The words weren't new. He had read them before in a book on Buddhism, but tonight they landed differently. Because for the first time, he understood them not just as words, but as something felt. He had spent a lifetime seeking validation, filling his time with people, with noise, with constant movement, thinking that was what happiness looked like. But what if it wasn't? What if the life he had built wasn't actually the life he wanted? And what if, for the first time, he had the courage to find out? One evening, Harold sat by his window watching the sunset. The sky was painted in gold and crimson, shifting with effortless beauty. And then, something clicked. This moment is beautiful, he thought, and I don't need anyone else to confirm it for me. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the urge to share it, to capture it, to tell someone else about it so they could validate his experience. It was just his moment, and that was enough. It was in that quiet realization that Harold understood a truth Buddhism had been teaching for centuries. Do not look for sanctuary in anyone except yourself. The need for external approval was an illusion, one he had spent a lifetime chasing. And now he was finally free from it. But that was only the beginning, because once he let go of the need for validation, he found himself facing another question, one that had been lingering in the background for years. Did he even enjoy being around so many people? For most of his life, Harold had equated a full schedule with a full heart. If he was constantly busy, constantly engaging, constantly surrounded by people, then surely he was living life to the fullest. But the more he reflected, the more he realized that many of his social interactions had been driven by obligation rather than genuine joy. How many of those dinner parties had he actually wanted to attend? How many phone calls had he answered just because he didn't want to seem rude? How many times had he nodded along in conversations that didn't interest him just to avoid an awkward silence? He wasn't alone in this. We live in a world that glorifies busyness. If you're not constantly engaging, constantly posting, constantly connecting, then you must be missing out. But what if that's not true? What if, instead of FOMO, the fear of missing out, we embrace something far more liberating, JOMO, the joy of missing out? Harold wasn't the first to reach this conclusion. Margaret, a woman in her 70s, had spent most of her life attending social gatherings because she thought that's just what people did. She had a routine, lunches with old friends, weekly dinner parties, the occasional social club meeting. But over time, she started noticing something. She would come home from these events feeling drained rather than fulfilled. Instead of being excited to go out, she started dreading certain phone calls. She found herself saying yes to invitations simply because she didn't want to explain why she was saying no. One evening, after yet another exhausting dinner where the same old gossip was recycled, Margaret sat in her living room, staring at the wall, and asked herself a simple but powerful question. Why am I doing this? Was it truly bringing her happiness? Or was she just going through the motions because she was afraid of what solitude might feel like? So she did something radical. She stopped. She stopped forcing herself into social interactions that didn't feel meaningful. She stopped feeling guilty for turning down invitations. Instead, she embraced solitude. At first, it was uncomfortable. The quiet felt strange, almost too still. But as days turned into weeks, she started discovering something unexpected: the beauty of being alone. She read books she had always meant to read, without worrying about interruptions. She spent long, unhurried mornings sitting on her porch, listening to the birds, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. She took walks in nature, truly observing the world around her. The way the leaves rustled in the wind, the way the sky changed colors during sunset, the way her own breath felt steady and alive in her chest. And most importantly, Margaret let go of the guilt. She realized that prioritizing her own peace wasn't selfish. It was necessary. She remembered a Buddhist teaching she had once read: "Silence is an empty space. Space is the home of the awakened mind." And for the first time in years, she felt awakened. But something else happened, something she hadn't expected. As the months went by, she noticed that without the constant noise of social interactions, her mind became clearer. She no longer replayed unnecessary conversations in her head, no longer worried about whether she had said the right thing, no longer felt drained from engaging in small talk that didn't matter. Instead, her thoughts became deeper, her inner world more peaceful. She started realizing that true companionship didn't always have to come in the form of human relationships. Sometimes it was in the connection she felt with nature. Sometimes it was in the joy of creating something with her own hands. Sometimes it was in the quiet wisdom she discovered within herself. One afternoon, an old friend called, inviting her to a gathering. Margaret smiled and politely declined. Not because she was avoiding people, but because she had something far more important to do. She had a quiet evening planned, just her and her thoughts, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. And that, she realized, was exactly where she wanted to be. Harold and Margaret both learned something that many people don't discover until much later in life. The world keeps moving, whether we participate in it or not. People will continue to gather, to celebrate, to connect, and that's beautiful. But we don't always have to be in the middle of it. Sometimes the greatest peace comes from stepping back, from watching instead of participating, from letting go instead of holding on. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that friendships don't matter, but that we don't have to hold on to them out of fear. We don't have to prove ourselves through how many people we know, how many events we attend, how many conversations we keep alive. Instead, we can simply be without expectation, without performance, without the exhausting chase for validation. Harold never stopped appreciating people. Neither did Margaret. But they both learned that friendships should add to your life, not drain it. And sometimes the greatest friendship you can cultivate is the one you have with yourself. It was a late autumn afternoon when Margaret first felt the weight of silence. Not the silence of an empty room or a paused conversation, but the deep, lingering kind, the kind that makes you question everything. She had just returned from yet another social gathering, one of those routine get-togethers where the conversation loops in circles, where people speak but don't really say anything. She closed the door behind her, leaned against it, and let out a long sigh. Why am I doing this? The question startled her. She had always been social, always surrounded by people. She was the one who never missed a dinner party, who always sent birthday messages, who made sure to be there for others. And yet, lately, all of it had begun to feel empty. Conversations felt forced, laughter didn't feel quite real, and she found herself waiting for the moment she could excuse herself and go home. And that's when she remembered something she had read years ago, a Buddhist parable about a man carrying a heavy sack of stones. One day, the man met the Buddha, who asked, "Why do you carry this burden?" "Because I always have," the man replied. The Buddha simply smiled and said, "Then put it down." Margaret sat with that thought. What if the friendships she had been holding on to weren't bringing her happiness anymore? What if, instead of feeling obligated to maintain them, she simply let go? At first, the idea felt radical, even selfish. She worried about what people would think. Would they assume she was withdrawing? Would they take offense? But then she realized, peace is not something you owe to others. It's something you owe to yourself. So she stopped. She stopped saying yes out of guilt. She stopped answering calls that drained her energy. She stopped forcing herself into social situations that didn't nourish her soul. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a different kind of silence. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of clarity. Many people fear solitude because they confuse it with loneliness. We are raised to believe that being alone is something to be avoided, something unnatural. But Buddhism teaches us otherwise. If you are quiet enough, you will hear the flow of the universe, the Buddha said. There is something profoundly powerful about learning to be at peace with your own company. Yet most of us spend our lives avoiding it. We fill our time with conversations, obligations, distractions. We scroll endlessly through social media, not because we are interested, but because we are afraid of facing the quiet. But what if solitude wasn't something to fear? What if it was a gift? A doorway to understanding yourself, to reclaiming your energy, to hearing your own thoughts without the noise of the world drowning them out. Margaret discovered this truth slowly. At first, the silence was unsettling. She would instinctively reach for her phone, feeling the urge to check messages, to fill the space with external noise. But over time, she began to embrace the quiet. She found herself reading books without distractions, enjoying her morning coffee without interruptions, and walking in nature with no one to impress. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way the leaves rustled in the wind, the way the sky shifted colors in the late afternoon, the rhythmic sound of her own footsteps. She realized that the world had always been this beautiful, but she had been too distracted to see it. And for the first time, she felt awakened. We often hold onto relationships long past their expiration date. We tell ourselves that we should stay in touch, that we must maintain connections, that being social is part of being alive. But who told us this? And more importantly, is it true? Friendships, like everything else in life, are impermanent. Some last decades, others a few years, some only a season. And that's okay. Not every person is meant to walk with us forever. But we resist letting go. Why? Because we believe that fewer friendships mean fewer connections, fewer memories, fewer moments of joy. But what if fewer friendships actually meant deeper peace? What if letting go of the people who no longer align with our energy opened up space for something even more valuable: clarity, freedom, self-discovery? Margaret learned this firsthand. She had one particular friendship that had lasted for years but had become increasingly exhausting. Every conversation was filled with complaints, negativity, and endless drama. Every interaction left her feeling depleted rather than enriched. And yet, she held on because it was a friendship of history, of habit, of expectation. One day, as she listened to yet another round of grievances about life, something inside her shifted. I don't have to be here, she thought. It was such a simple realization, yet so profound. That night, she made a decision. She would no longer invest her energy in relationships that drained her. She would no longer feel obligated to be someone's emotional caretaker at the cost of her own peace. And so, with quiet grace, she let go. Buddhism teaches that attachment is the root of suffering. We hold on to things, people, expectations, identities because we fear what will happen if we let go. But the irony is, true peace comes only when we stop clinging. Margaret didn't become a recluse. She didn't cut off everyone in her life. But she did become intentional. She chose to spend time only with people who brought her joy. She sought out conversations that felt meaningful, rather than those that felt like obligations. She allowed herself long stretches of solitude, not because she was avoiding life, but because she was finally living it on her own terms. And something incredible happened. She became lighter, freer, more at peace than she had ever been. We all have a Margaret inside us. Maybe you're holding on to relationships that no longer serve you. Maybe you fill your schedule with obligations that leave you exhausted. Maybe you fear that if you stop being socially active, you'll somehow become irrelevant. But ask yourself, Is this truly bringing me joy? If the answer is no, then maybe it's time to do what Margaret did. Maybe it's time to put the sack of stones down. Let go of the friendships that feel forced. Let go of the guilt for wanting peace over people. Let go of the idea that your worth is tied to how many people surround you. And instead, try this. Sit in silence. Listen to your own thoughts. Walk without distractions. Learn to love your own company. Because when you do, you might just realize that solitude was never something to fear. It was a gift waiting for you all along. So tell me, when was the last time you truly enjoyed being alone? One evening, William sat on his porch, staring at the fading sunlight. The autumn breeze carried golden leaves to the ground, and for the first time in his life, he truly watched them fall. Noticed how effortless it was. No struggle, no hesitation, just a quiet release. The trees didn't mourn the loss of their leaves. They let them go, knowing it was simply part of the cycle. He wondered why it was so hard for people to do the same. For years, William had been the kind of friend who held on. The one who remembered birthdays, who checked in, who sent messages when too much time had passed. He had always believed that friendships, like well-tended gardens, would flourish if only he kept watering them. But lately, he had begun to see things differently. Started with a realization. A quiet, painful one. He was always the one reaching out first. Always the one carrying the weight of keeping things alive. At first, he told himself it was just life, that people got busy. But as time passed, the unanswered messages, the forgotten calls, the one-sided effort began to feel heavier. He tried to ignore the quiet truth pressing at the back of his mind. But one day, as he left yet another voicemail that would go unreturned, he finally asked himself, why does this hurt so much? He sat with that question for a long time. And then, as if on cue, a memory surfaced, something he had read years ago in a book on Buddhism. Let go or be dragged. The words landed in his chest like a stone. That's exactly what he had been doing. Holding on so tightly to friendships that no longer served him, to relationships that had already slipped away. He had been dragging the weight of them for years, unwilling to accept that they were already gone. At first, the thought of letting go felt unnatural. Weren't friendships supposed to last forever? Weren't they worth fighting for? But the more he reflected, the more he realized how much of his holding on wasn't about the friendships themselves. It was about who he had been in those friendships. He wasn't just mourning people. He was mourning the version of himself that had existed with them. The young man who had spent nights laughing until sunrise. The ambitious worker who had bonded with colleagues over shared struggles. The father who had connected with other parents when their kids were still young. But life had moved forward, and those moments belonged to a different time. No amount of effort could bring them back. And so, slowly, he let go. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with peace. He stopped chasing. He stopped making the first move. He let the natural flow of life decide which friendships remained. Some people, to his surprise, reached out when he stopped trying so hard. Others simply faded away, and instead of feeling lonely, he felt lighter. The world teaches us to fear solitude, to believe that a life without constant social engagement is empty. But William started to see things differently. He spent his mornings in quiet reflection, sipping tea on his porch, watching the way the world woke up. He walked without checking his phone, without feeling the need to fill every silence with conversation. And for the first time, he truly understood the Buddhist teaching of impermanence. Nothing is meant to last forever. Not youth, not time, not even the people we love. But that doesn't mean we lose them. It just means their role in our story changes. One afternoon, after months of silence, an old friend called. Their voice was warm, familiar, but William felt something different in himself. He no longer felt the usual rush of relief, the need to prove that the connection was still there. He simply listened, present in the moment without expectation. Because he knew now, if a friendship needs to be forced, it's not really a friendship. If a connection is meant to remain, it will. And if it fades, then maybe it was only ever meant to be a stepping stone on the path of life, not the destination itself. As the wind carried another golden leaf to the ground, William smiled. He thought about the people who had come and gone, the memories that would always remain, the peace he had found in embracing the present. And in that moment, he understood something he wished he had learned years ago. Some friendships are like trees, deeply rooted and unwavering. Others are like leaves, beautiful for a time but always meant to fall. And when we finally stop holding on, we realize we were never losing anything at all. So tell me, are there friendships in your life that you are holding on to out of fear, not love? Are you chasing connections that no longer serve you, simply because you're afraid of what will happen if you stop? So take a deep breath, and remember the wisdom of the trees. Let go, not in sadness, not in bitterness, but in gratitude. For what was, for what is, and for whatever is meant to come next. It was a Sunday afternoon when Richard first heard it. Not a loud sound, not even something external, but a quiet ticking inside his own mind. A slow, rhythmic awareness that time was slipping away. He was sitting at yet another dinner party, listening to a conversation he had already heard a dozen times before. The same stories, the same polite laughter, the same empty pleasantries. He glanced around the table, seeing faces he had known for years, yet feeling strangely distant from all of them. Something inside him whispered, "Is this really how I want to spend my time?" For years, he had never questioned it. He had always shown up, always been part of the social gatherings, always kept himself busy. That's just what people did, right? Stay connected, stay engaged, stay relevant. But as he got older, something shifted. The conversations started to feel repetitive. The gatherings felt obligatory instead of enjoyable. The people he once felt so close to now felt like acquaintances he was maintaining out of habit rather than genuine connection. And that's when he realized the way he had been spending his time no longer aligned with what truly mattered to him. When we're young, time feels endless. We give it away freely, to people, to obligations, to distractions we don't even care about. We say yes to everything because we think we have all the time in the world. But something changes as we get older. We begin to see time for what it really is. Finite, precious, and slipping through our fingers faster than we expected. Richard felt that shift deep in his bones. He started noticing how much of his time was being spent on things that didn't bring him joy. How often he filled his days with obligations that left him drained instead of fulfilled. How many hours he spent listening to conversations that no longer interested him, simply because it was easier than walking away. That night, as he drove home, he made a decision. He would no longer spend his time on things that didn't bring him joy. First, it felt strange. He had built his life around staying busy, around always being part of something. But now, instead of filling his days with mindless socializing, he started prioritizing what truly mattered. Mornings became his time for reflection. He would sit on his porch, sipping tea, watching the world wake up. The stillness that once felt unsettling now felt like a gift. He spent his afternoons painting, something he had always loved but never made time for. And in the evenings, instead of going to dinners that left him feeling drained, he watched the sunset in silence, feeling more at peace than he had in years. The Buddha once said, "The trouble is, you think you have time, but the truth is we don't. We waste so much of it thinking we'll always have more. More time to see old friends, more time to do what we love, more time to just be present. But when we finally stop and look back, we see how much of it we've already lost to obligations that didn't matter, to conversations that didn't nourish us, to people who never truly saw us." So Richard let go. He let go of the belief that he had to be everywhere for everyone. He let go of the guilt that came with choosing himself. He let go of the idea that a full calendar meant a full life. Because it didn't. One day, an old acquaintance called, inviting him to a large social gathering. The kind he used to attend out of obligation. He paused for a moment, considering it, then asked himself, "Is this really how I want to spend my time?" The answer was no, so he politely declined. And instead of spending the evening in a crowded room, making small talk that wouldn't matter the next day, he sat on his porch, watching the sky shift from gold to deep blue. He breathed in the cool air, felt the stillness settle inside him, and smiled. Because he knew now, life isn't measured by how many people surround you, but by how deeply you are present in the moments you choose to keep. And in that moment, he had everything he needed. So now, let me ask you, are you spending your time on things that truly bring you joy? Or are you letting it slip away on obligations that no longer serve you? If today were your last, would you be at peace with how you lived it? If not, maybe it's time to pause, to step back, to ask yourself the same question Richard did. Is this really how I want to spend my time? And if the answer is no, then maybe it's time to start choosing differently. Have you ever been surrounded by people, but still felt completely alone? Ella had. For 76 years, she had built her life around others, always showing up, always making sure everyone felt welcomed, always being the person people could turn to. Her calendar was never empty. Dinners, gatherings, coffee dates, casual visits. Her phone was always buzzing. She was never truly alone. And yet, despite all of it, there were nights when she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why she still felt an ache in her chest. A quiet, unspoken emptiness. It wasn't loneliness, not in the way people usually think about it. She had people. She had conversations. But something was missing, something she couldn't quite name. One evening, at yet another dinner party, it finally hit her. She was seated at a beautifully arranged table, surrounded by familiar faces, listening to the familiar hum of conversation. People laughed, clinked their glasses, exchanged pleasantries they had shared 100 times before. And as she smiled, nodded, played her part, a thought surfaced in her mind, clear and undeniable. I don't belong here anymore. She excused herself to the restroom, but instead of returning to the table, she stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of autumn. She closed her eyes, taking in the silence, the kind of silence that doesn't exist inside crowded rooms. And in that moment, a question rose from deep within her. Am I truly enjoying this? For the first time in her life, she let herself answer honestly. No, startled her. She had spent so many years telling herself that being part of these gatherings was important, that staying connected meant staying alive. But now, standing in the stillness of the night, she realized something she had been avoiding for years. She wasn't afraid of being alone. She was afraid of admitting that she no longer wanted to be surrounded. Most people fear solitude. We are raised to believe that being alone is unnatural, that silence is something to be filled. We say yes to invitations out of obligation. We keep conversations going even when there's nothing left to say. We hold on to friendships long past their expiration date because the alternative, letting go, feels too much like losing. But what if solitude wasn't something to fear? What if, instead of being a void, it was an invitation? Ella sat with that thought for days. She began noticing just how much energy she had spent adjusting herself to fit in, keeping up appearances, maintaining connections that no longer nourished her. She had been saying yes to things she didn't enjoy, entertaining conversations she wasn't interested in, holding on to relationships not out of love, but out of habit. So she made a decision. She stepped back. She stopped forcing herself to be part of conversations that drained her. She stopped attending gatherings that left her feeling empty rather than fulfilled. She stopped trying to fit into places where she no longer belonged. And something remarkable happened. At first, the quiet was unsettling. She found herself instinctively reaching for her phone, feeling the urge to fill the space with noise. But over time, the silence became comforting. She rediscovered books she had meant to read for years. She spent mornings sipping tea on her porch, listening to the world wake up. She took long walks without the weight of obligation pressing down on her. And in that stillness, she realized she had never been alone to begin with. Buddhism teaches that when we stop fearing solitude, we begin to hear the universe whisper to us. Ella understood that now. The noise of the world had kept her distracted for so long, but in her newfound stillness, she began to notice things she had overlooked before. The way sunlight filtered through her windows at different hours of the day, the feeling of her own breath when she truly paid attention, the way a single moment of presence could feel more fulfilling than 100 conversations filled with empty words. She also began to notice something else. Without the pressure to constantly be surrounded, she felt lighter. She no longer needed to explain herself, to shrink or expand depending on the people around her. She had nothing to prove, no role to play, no expectation to meet. She belonged fully to herself. One afternoon, months after she had started embracing solitude, her phone rang. It was an old friend, someone she had once spent hours talking to but hadn't heard from in a while. "Ella, it's been so long. Let's have dinner soon," her friend said. There was a time when Ella would have immediately said yes, even if she didn't feel like it. She would have rearranged her plans, set aside her own needs, just to maintain the friendship. But now, she paused. Not because she didn't care, but because she had learned something invaluable. Not all connections need to last forever. Some friendships are like seasonal flowers, beautiful for a time before naturally fading away. And that's okay. So instead of saying yes out of obligation, she asked herself, do I truly want this? And when the answer came, she honored it. That evening, instead of sitting in a crowded restaurant, she sat on her porch, watching the sky shift from deep blue to soft pink. And for the first time in her life, she felt whole. Not because she was surrounded by people, not because she was keeping up appearances, but because she had finally made peace with herself. So now, let me ask you, have you ever found yourself in a room full of people, yet feeling completely alone? Have you ever said yes to something not because you wanted to, but because you were afraid of what saying no might mean? If you stopped adjusting yourself to fit into places you've outgrown, who would you become? If you stopped fearing solitude, what might you discover? Take a deep breath. Listen to the quiet, because maybe, just maybe, everything you've been looking for has been waiting for you in the stillness all along. What if everything you've been holding on to is exactly what's been holding you back? James sat in the middle of a crowded restaurant, the warm glow of candlelight flickering against the polished glasses, voices rising and falling in waves around him. He had been here 1,000 times before. Different faces, same conversations. Stories told and retold like well-rehearsed scripts. Polite laughter filling the gaps where real connection used to be. He picked up his glass, swirled the wine, and stared at the candle in front of him. The wax softened, melting slowly, surrendering to the inevitable pull of time. And just like that, it hit him. I don't need this anymore. The realization was so simple, so sudden, yet it felt like something that had been waiting inside him for years. He didn't need to keep showing up to these gatherings just because he always had. He didn't need to keep conversations alive just to avoid silence. He didn't need to stay tethered to friendships that had long since lost their depth. For most of his life, James had believed that staying socially active equaled happiness. That to be seen, to be relevant, to be included, that was what life was about. A full schedule meant a full heart. But now, as he sat among familiar faces that felt increasingly distant, he realized he had been mistaking motion for meaning. That night, as he stepped out into the cool evening air, he felt something strange, lightness. The weight of expectation, of obligation, of playing a role he no longer resonated with began to lift. The world hadn't changed, but something inside him had. For the first time, he let himself wonder, what if happiness wasn't about holding on, but about knowing when to let go? Letting go has never been easy. We are wired to cling, to people, to places, to memories that once meant everything. We convince ourselves that longevity equals value, that the more we keep, the richer our lives will be. But Buddhism teaches something entirely different. You only lose what you cling to, and James was beginning to see the truth in that. So he started to release. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand farewell, no sudden cutoff from the world. Just small shifts, like autumn leaves quietly detaching from their branches. He stopped saying yes when he really wanted to say no. He stopped calling people who never called him first. He stopped filling his days with conversations that left him feeling emptier than the silence he once feared. At first, it felt strange, almost unnatural. His phone was quieter. His schedule had more empty spaces. The quiet crept in like an old song he had forgotten, and for a while, he didn't know what to do with it. But then, something beautiful happened. The emptiness wasn't empty at all. It was space. Space for stillness, for peace, for things he had long neglected. Mornings became slower, more intentional. He would wake up with no rush, sip his coffee on the porch, watched the way the light shifted through the trees. Afternoons were filled with books he had always meant to read, long walks where he could actually hear the sound of his own breath. Evenings were no longer spent in crowded rooms, forcing laughter, but instead under the soft glow of the sky, where silence finally felt like a friend. He realized that freedom had never been about doing more. It had always been about needing less. Not everyone understood. Some friends noticed his absence and reached out. "Are you okay?" they would ask, as if solitude was something that needed fixing. He smiled, reassured them that he was fine because for the first time in a long time he actually was. And the ones who didn't notice, he let them go too. Not out of anger, not out of sadness, but with gratitude for the seasons they had shared. Because that was the truth he had been avoiding for so long. Some relationships are not meant to last forever. Like trees shedding leaves in autumn, we are meant to evolve, to change, to release what no longer serves us so that we can make room for what's next. And the most surprising part? The world didn't stop spinning just because he chose to reclaim his time. Life carried on. The friendships that truly mattered remained. And most importantly, he remained. One afternoon, months after that night in the restaurant, he sat on a park bench watching a young boy fly a kite. The child ran with wild abandon, laughing as the wind pulled the kite higher and higher. But what struck James wasn't the running. It was the moment the boy stopped, let go of the string, and simply watched. He didn't chase. He didn't cling. He just stood there, eyes lifted to the sky, at peace with the beauty of what was, rather than trying to keep it tethered. James smiled to himself, because that was it, wasn't it? The secret no one had ever told him. Life isn't about how much you hold on to. It's about knowing when to let go. So now I ask you, what are you still clinging to? A friendship that has run its course? A version of yourself that no longer exists? A life that feels more like an obligation than a joy? Take a deep breath. Feel the weight of everything you've been carrying. And when you're ready, set it down. Because maybe, just maybe, freedom has been waiting for you all along. Harold didn't become a recluse. He didn't shut the world out or push people away. But something inside him shifted. He stopped forcing conversations that didn't flow naturally. He stopped filling his time with events that left him drained. He stopped saying yes when his heart was quietly whispering no. And he learned something surprising. The world didn't stop just because he chose to step back. The people who truly mattered, they stayed. The ones who only existed in his life out of habit, they faded. And instead of feeling loss, he felt something he never expected, relief. One afternoon, an old friend called, inviting him to a gathering. "Come on, it's been too long," they said, laughing. Harold looked outside, where the sun was beginning to set, washing the sky in warm, golden light. And he smiled, not because he was about to say yes, but because, for the first time, he knew he didn't have to. He politely declined, not because he was isolating himself, but because he had something far more important to do. He had an evening planned, just him and his thoughts, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sky change, embracing the quiet, feeling at home in his own presence. And that, he realized, was exactly where he wanted to be. So now, let me ask you, are there moments in your life that you're filling with noise, just because you're afraid of the silence? Are there friendships you're holding on to not out of love, but out of habit? And if you finally let go of expectations, of obligations, of the exhausting need to prove your worth, what kind of life might you create instead? Take a deep breath. Listen to the quiet. Because maybe, just maybe, everything you've been searching for has been waiting for you there all along.